And so now let's think through this new world that's coming with our first session of the day. That will tackle one of the results of increasing deglobalization, deepening trade wars. We've seen an expanded use of retaliatory economic measures, battles for semiconductor supremacy, and heightened tensions over digital security. What's more, the trend towards isolationism has picked up pace, with the global public health crisis raising questions about vaccine access. So we'll be looking at how African companies can operate best in this new age and at how much of an impact the African Continental Free Trade Area can have on securing the continent's prospects. With us for the first panel to discuss Africa in the age of the new trade wars, it is my honour to introduce Her Excellency Rania Al-Mashat, Minister of International Cooperation for Egypt. Rania, thanks. It's great to have you. Thanks so much for making time for us.
Thank you.
Also, we have
pleasure being with you.
Thank you very much, Minister. We also have Stephanie von Friedberg, the Senior Vice President for Operations at the IFC. Stephanie, great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
And we also have Chairman Husseini Dlamini from Massmart Holdings and Aspen Pharmacare Holdings. We're really looking forward to what you have to say, Chairman. It's great to have you here. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to our fourth and final panelist, who is, of course, the amazing Professor Carlos Lopez. Thank you very much, Husseini. Carlos Lopez, who's the honorary professor at the University of Cape Town and visiting professor at Sciences Po Paris. Carlos, lovely to have you, to be speaking to you again. Okay, so before we hear what our distinguished panel has to say, we have the pleasure of having with us Atsi Chef, who is the Managing Director of Credit Strategy at Moody's, who will be setting the scene for us with her expert analysis of the opportunities and hurdles facing Africa as it moves towards post-pandemic growth. Atsi, over to you.
Welcome to our panel on Africa in the age of the new trade wars. My job today is to set the preface to the panel discussion that will follow by sharing with you some data and the 4 key conclusions and questions that it raises. The first 2 are challenges. Number 1, global trade and investment growth have been slowing for a decade now, and this makes it more challenging for economies around the world to use trade and investment as a pathway to fuller economic development. Second, and this is specific to Africa, commodities still dominate Africa's global exports. And this, we believe, exposes its economies to multiple different shocks that may even grow in the future. But the next 2 are opportunities. 1, the size and diversity of the Pan-African economy is such that regional trade integration may offer that path to economic development that global trade may not any longer. And second, in an aging world, Africa's demographics with its youthful population offer domestic market growth opportunities. And here I should say that ultimately, all economic development should serve human welfare and human aspirations. So the question for the panel will be how to ensure that Africa's human capital is leading to greater economic dynamism in Africa. What does the data tell us? So let's turn to that first. Here, what you see in front of you is on the left-hand side, the growth in global trade and emerging and developing country export volumes slowed substantially over the last decade, hovering just under the 5% mark. This compares to almost 10% in the 90s and the early 2000s, and even over 10% in some years. So, the era of rapid global trade growth seems to be perhaps behind us. What you see on the right is that if that era is behind us, African economies did not benefit as much from it. Despite hosting 17% of the global population, Africa only accounts for 3 to 4% of global GDP growth, global trade, and global FDI. And in fact, the pandemic has put a further setback to this participation in global trade and FDI. You see that FDI and trade suffered a bigger hit than even GDP growth did during 2020. My next point is that even the participation that Africa has in global trade is dominated by commodities. And this is, of course, taking advantage of Africa's natural resources. But as you see on the right, what this means is that Africa is relatively less integrated into the manufacturing global supply chains than its peers in, say, Latin America or Asia. Well, what does this mean? Well, the commodity dependence is great when commodity prices are booming, but as we all know, they can be volatile. So Africa suffers from that risk of commodity price volatility. Second, commodity extraction, if it dominates an economy, could expose it to increasing environmental, social, and governance risks. So for example, if you're a fossil fuel exporter in today's day and age, you are facing the risk of a world that is moving away from fossil fuels. That's another risk. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, is that integration into global supply chains has yielded technology, productivity, employment, and income growth to countries that have managed to do this, and Africa has not benefited as much from that. Now, one example again is when US-China trade tensions were brewing in the last several years, many countries in Asia and Latin America saw an increased demand for their exports or increased investment from global companies who wanted to diversify their supply chains and went to those countries that were already part of the supply chain. Now, if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see that African economies weren't part of that supply chain to China and the US because their exports to China and the US are again dominated by commodities. So they couldn't take advantage of those trade tensions and the overflow of supply chain into smaller economies. But that doesn't mean that African economies don't have a competitive advantage in manufacturing. If you look right on the top left-hand side, to its major trading partner, in fact, its biggest trading partner, the EU, African economies deliver a substantial share of manufacturing exports, and that's the dark green panel over there. So Africa can manufacture and can export manufacturing. The question for the panel is, how do we boost it so that it yields, again, greater employment, productivity, and growth? One answer to that question is, how do we boost productivity, growth, and trade, is trade regionalization. If you look on the left-hand side of the panel, you will see that between 2010 and 2020, there was a substantial increase in the amount of regional trade agreements that were signed around the world. If you remember that first slide that I showed you, that period was when global trade growth was actually slowing, but regional trade agreements were being signed more rapidly. And again, think back on that slide and look at how Asian and European intra-regional trade increased during that same time. So Asia, inter-regional, and European trade bucked the trend of global trade. And as a result, both Asia and Europe have become global trade powerhouses as well by trading amongst themselves more vigorously. Look on the right-hand side, African inter-regional trade, of course, not as high as a share of Africa's overall trade as it is in Europe and Asia. But one thing stands out, manufacturing is a greater share of African inter-regional trade than it is of Africa's global export profile. So that's an area that's telling you that yes, inter-regional trade could indeed spur greater manufacturing and greater productivity. The question for the panel is the answer to put more trade agreements in place, or is it to develop infrastructure and other issues that might sort of spur both manufacturing and trade? I will leave them to answer that, and I'll just make my last point, which is this, that so far in the last few minutes, we've been focusing on merchandise trade and manufacturing as the pathway to growth and development. Some might argue that the causality works the other way, that if you have economic growth and development through domestic infrastructure building, through domestic jobs creation, through domestic market and consumption development, you will then have greater trade integration and manufacturing integration as well. So that's an argument that some might make. And here, what is the advantage that Africa might have in terms of developing its own domestic market? It is its people. Companies around the world are recognizing they're in established markets where populations are aging. Our population growth is either low and even negative in some cases, whereas Africa has a young and growing population. And so the market could be there. And if you look on the right-hand side, what you're seeing is that the investment that's coming into Africa, these are some of the top sectors, is coming in to consumer-oriented, domestic market-oriented sectors. This is ex-commodities, and they are services. They're not necessarily manufacturing. So technology, media, telecommunications, real estate, financial services, all geared towards domestic market growth. So again, the question for the panel is, can the human capital be developed enough that income growth, accelerates enough that this investment also accelerates? Because currently, even with all this diverse investment, it is only 3% share in the total FDI in the world. So having posed these difficult questions to the panel, I have come to the end of my own remarks, and I will pass the baton on to you, Georgia. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for bearing with us. We had a bit of a technical hitch, but we are back with you, ready to head in to the panel. Thanks again, Atsi, for that scene-setting speech that you delivered to get us into the mood of what's going on. First of all, I'm going to turn to you, Minister Al-Mashat. What is your take on the obstacles and opportunities to African trade outlined here?
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join my colleagues on this panel. And I agree with a lot of what was mentioned. I mean, the question was posed, do we need more regional agreements or do we need more investment in infrastructure? And I think it's the latter for sure. The African Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Agreement has been on the table. It's a conducive way to push forward when it comes to trade. And as was pointed out, the trade within Africa, intra-African trade is very low. It's around 16%. If we compare it to Europe or Asia, which are 68 and 59%, we can see that discrepancy. Also, the mention of the comparative advantage that Africa has when it comes to the population, to the youth, etc. These are all very important points. Let me just say that concepts of protectionism and trade wars was very vivid and started before the COVID. So this was the rhetoric in the international and global community before 2020. When 2020 started with the COVID, of course, at the beginning, there was a lot of extra measures governments are taking to protect themselves when it comes to the needs related to health and personal protection items. But soon after that, it was very clear that we would only be able to go out of this if everybody works together. So this was the positive twist or the silver lining from COVID. We in Africa find huge opportunities when it comes to trade, and it was very insightful in the presentation that actually, unlike conventional wisdom, manufacturing between the exports or the trade in manufacturing goods between countries in the continent are actually higher than the commodity trade itself. I think, and I'm sure we're going to discuss this further in the panel, encouraging the role of private sector is something that we should be working on in our relative countries. Trying to streamline regulations is something which is extremely important to be able to push forward. So we have the infrastructure on regulations. And then, of course, another very key element is the digital platforms that also would help with e-commerce. So those are three items that I would at the outset like to mention, and then looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Minister. Now, Stephanie, we heard the Minister talking about the importance of supporting the private sector there. You're the global representative of the private sector on this panel. So what resonated with you from Atsi's presentation?
So thank you very much again for the invitation. I want to take a step back and frame global trade and maybe the growth of global trade. Over the last 50 years, global trade and its growth have really increased jobs and prosperity in almost every country in the world. 75 years ago, 60% of the people on the planet lived on the equivalent of $1.90 a day in extreme poverty. Today, that number is 10%. And that decline is largely driven by global trade. Now, COVID has clearly set us back, and we're estimating that as many as 150 million people may fall back into extreme poverty. And trade is the way to get us out. And honestly, it is the best thing for Africa. So I would actually say maybe there's two buckets we need to focus on. First, Atsi said very well, most of the exports that are coming out of Africa today are raw materials. So we need to work on vertical integration and developing the industrialization and use of those raw materials on the continent. So think, instead of exporting iron ore, we're going to export steel ingot, or instead of exporting raw cocoa beans, we're going to export chocolate slurry. So there are things that we need to be thinking about around that, which will generate jobs and, quite frankly, more skilled jobs for the young generation on the continent. It will require rethinking some of the policy and regulation that exists at the country level and at the regional level. And second, we need to think about, as everyone has said, Africa trading with Africa. It is the future of the century for Africa, and it is a huge opportunity. There will be at least 150 million people that come into the middle class over the next decade. That's an opportunity to create consumer-led growth and increase competition on the continent. I think to make that happen, we need to focus on two things: building the regional infrastructure and sub-infrastructure that will support the connectivity of the continent, all 54 countries. And together with that, really begin to think about value chains and value creation from those raw materials through to the end consumer product. And that means onshoring and nearshoring more than has happened in the past, and increasing FDI on the continent. And I really look forward, as we come out of the crisis, to figure out how IFC and our partners can help with that.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Now, Kusani, you are one of the biggest African retailers with Massmart, but you're also an industrialist with Aspen Pharmacare. Do you feel or fear any impact from these kind of new trade wars that we've been talking about, or does it all seem a bit abstract to you from your position?
I agree with all the comments that have been made by Stephanie and Minister Al-Mashat as well. From where I sit, I really think that now is the time for the African private sector to really grow its strength and resilience, so that we can position Africa as a winner in the global trade wars of our time. And as things are now, Africa's private sector is not as strong as it should be, and therefore Africa is not able to assert itself and emerge effectively and strongly in the trade wars that we see. As Aspen Pharmacare, the company that is global in terms of our manufacturing, a strong example that what does help to be able to be an effective player in the global scheme of things. But that's just not enough. We have one or a few companies that are able to do that. We have regional centers of excellence across North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. And I think the pandemic has been a great wake-up call for the African private sector to really be strengthened, so that it can play a full and visible role in the global scheme of things. I mean, Stephanie spoke about trade as being a force for good, and I fully agree with that. But it is countries that must play a role in trade. It's not countries without a strong private sector. And we saw from Atsi's presentation that Africa has got a huge deficit in terms of its penetration of global trade. We are only at 3%, whereas we represent about 13% of the world's population. So that's a gap that needs to be addressed. I see it as an opportunity gap that needs to be addressed. We need to have world-class companies across different sectors that can be able to be in the top 10 globally in the various sectors. And that requires a very strategic investment in creating an ecosystem, the growth.
Kusani, I'm just going to switch over to Carlos there. So Kusani was setting out just some of the lost opportunities. But do you also see, Carlos Lopez, as an economist, that these trade wars that we're kind of looking at the moment may also represent potential gains and risks? And if there's anything else that you think might be a challenge to the recovery of trade on the continent that perhaps wasn't included in Atsi's presentation? That question to Carlos Lopez. Carlos, can you hear me? Okay, Kusani, what's your take on that? I mean, do you think that there's anything else that you would have liked to have seen included in that overview of some of the challenges regarding trade faced by the continent. Oh, I think we do actually have Carlos back. Carlos, it would be great if you could jump in and give us your take on that question.
No, thank you. I was saying that we have the trends that were presented, but we also have some acceleration of phenomena that is important for us to bear in mind. In the last few years, we can see some risks that have been accentuated. For instance, one is the battle of jurisdictions, the decision by some countries that affect others. We have seen it recently with the corporate tax for digital conglomerates, but you can see it in the way the financial sector has been working. You can see it in the way some of the regulations are done in the e-commerce area. And you can see it introduced more and more in the green economy prospects. So we have this concern because Africa is a minor player. It enters into a situation where Africa cannot control this battle of jurisdictions and just, is affected by it. The second trend is a new forms of protectionism. The fact that you have now, through carbon tax, net zero targets, and other very important mechanisms to protect the planet, a disguised way of introducing subsidies to corporations that are going to compete with the Africans in an unfair playing field. For instance, the Africans will not be able to surpass the carbon tax that the Europeans are going to introduce without some forms of compensation. Their enterprises will be protected for a number of years, much longer than the ones that are going to enter their market. And therefore, we are going to be deeply affected by this disguised protectionism that is going to be presented as for the common good. The same happens with the vaccines. Distributing vaccines instead of increasing manufacturing capacity is a disguised form of protectionism. And then the third is the divergent macroeconomic requirements that are prevailing today. You have, for a certain number of countries, rules that are completely different from the rest. The Africans continue to adhere to macroeconomic orthodoxy because that's what is imposed to them. Whereas, the countries in the north, and particularly the richest countries, can actually afford stimulus packages, can afford to just throw away all the rule book regarding macroeconomic orthodoxy. And this is going to create, obviously, a very different perception of risk. You bubble assets in the north in such a way that you create a non-level playing field. And therefore, the Africans are going to suffer from it. Now, we do have some opportunities, too, that are accelerating. One is that the US-China trade war in particular is creating windows for us to negotiate better as Africans because, we can take advantage of this competition. And we can also have in mind this idea that, our market is growing. We have the youngest population. Therefore, the more tech-intensive products became and processes become, the more appealing they will be for the younger generation. And fortunately for Africa, most of the young in the future are going to be African. The second element is that we have strategic minerals that are not being taken on board in terms of value addition. We can have another wave of commodity dependence without transformation, or we can use the green transition call for us to actually enter through leapfrogging a completely different market because our strategic minerals are going to be essential for the future, be it graphite, be it rare earths, cobalt, lithium, and so on. And finally, the last is that we have a return much more higher for renewable energy than for fossil fuels in the future. That's what the future markets say. And most of the renewable potential is in Africa, particularly the ones that have not yet been completely explored, like green hydrogen, that are particularly appealing for countries that have a combination of sea and desert. So those are some of the opportunities that we have.
Thanks so much, Carlos, for talking us through some of the nuance to protectionism there, but also that very hopeful note on which you wrapped up. Minister, considering the rise of protectionism in all its faces, as set out by Carlos, do you think that global multilateral trade agreements are on the decline? And if that's the case, How much do you reckon that's likely to impact the continent and its trade recovery?
I mean, what we hear, and especially we cannot ignore the geopolitics that is happening and the reshaping of relationships between countries, given the sort of the polarization that's taking place. Nonetheless, as was mentioned from the previous speakers, and also the conviction that the only way forward, given the population growth in the continent, the need to create jobs, is to create more, as Stephanie mentioned, more vertical integration when it comes to industrialization, trying to make sure that successful examples of private sector manufacturing firms in one country can actually be also opening up in other countries within the continent. So there is, notwithstanding what's happening around us, an opportunity to try and mitigate the implications of the trade wars or the protectionist rhetoric and the geopolitical changes that are taking place in a fashion that actually creates opportunities on the continent. I believe that the African, continental free trade agreement is there. It's a mechanism. What needs to happen going forward is, to put actions when it comes to how to activate it a little bit more. We talked about regulations. We talked about the infrastructure, including the digital infrastructure. Also, international institutions like the IFC have a big role to play because there's an opportunity to add equity into the companies that actually have promise. As was discussed, the population projection and how many are going to be in the middle class going forward create opportunities for anyone who's going to invest. So, in addition, it's not just I don't want to say a charity, but it's really a business model that is going to be profitable. So how can we showcase this? How can we market this? How can we take very concrete actions? Also, Professor Lopez mentioned this concept of renewable energy, and we have very important examples of plants that are today renewable, big projects that were financed by the international community, such as the BIM-BAM project. And so this is another example of important manufacturing, if you will, or the use of environmentally sound technologies to move forward. So I think it's not, there's no fear about, what will happen to, increasing free trade agreements going forward. I think what we need to work on is how to make sure we benefit, all of us benefit from the free trade agreements that have already been drafted, because I don't think we have met the potential of these agreements. I think there's a lot of political will. I think that today the private sector in Africa is more vibrant, in different key sectors, be it pharma, be it, other food processing, etc. But we need to increase those. So we need to showcase the successful examples. We need to also find financing in ways that does not increase burden, but actually pushes this message forward. And as I say, we really need to use the potential or see the potential of the regional agreements that already exist.
Minister, thank you so much for that. Now, you mentioned the importance of the private sector and pharma, and also, going back to what some of the earlier issues raised, some of the concrete problems that the continent's facing. Kuseni, when it comes to the rise of protectionist outlooks that we've seen over the last couple of years, the continent's scramble to get its hands on enough COVID-19 vaccines is a very big part of that. So from your take, what role has the private sector and companies like Aspen played in pushing the conversations that have to be had on that front?
We've played a very active role in working with the authorities at a national level and also at the level of the African Union. And we're also pleased that the IFC has been a very key partner in really assisting us in terms of building the capacity and capabilities around manufacturing. It's a very sad and concerning case that 99% of vaccines that are used in Africa are actually imported, and only 1% are manufactured in Africa. The key issue is really building scale across the continent to manufacture not just vaccines, but other medical products that are required. And as we hope to exit the pandemic, we have to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic, because there will be another pandemic, and we need to make sure that we are not exposed as we have been. We saw when the pandemic started, African countries were in the bottom of the queue in terms of access to PPE, and now in terms of access to vaccine. We've seen the scourge of vaccine nationalism rearing its ugly head across the world, and a lot of rich countries hoarding vaccines. And as we speak now, less than 3% of Africa's population is vaccinated. But it's not because of a shortage of vaccines, but it's simply because the vaccine haves are hoarding those vaccines, and the vaccine have-nots are being left behind. So we have to make sure that we use this as an opportunity, not just to be victims, but to start building our own manufacturing capacities, and using the kind of climate that is emerged now, as Minister Al-Mashat was saying, and Stephanie mentioned also earlier, that Africa's private sector is very strong and resilient, but we need to expand it across all industries.
Thank you so much for that, Kuseni. I think that's a perfect opportunity for me to invite Stephanie to give us a little bit of an insight as to what the IFC has been doing to support Africa's push to expand vaccine manufacturing and distribution.
So absolutely, and I think Kuseni said it well. COVID has really laid bare the inequalities globally, and the is exactly what we're looking at. And so we did very recently lead 600 million euro financing with a group of DFIs for Aspen, so that we could begin to, in the short term, make vaccines available on the continent that were being produced on the continent. So that was just the beginning, though. And we've now started a scaling health program in Africa, because we believe that we need to build a resilient, robust health ecosystem on the continent in Africa, which really comes back to the core of this panel. It's all about regional trade and regional integration. So in order to make vaccines, we need other products as well. We need needles, we need vials, we need clean saline. We also need PPE, as Kuseni mentioned, and being able to produce basic gloves, cotton swabs. All of these kinds of things can and should be done on the continent, so that when there is the next crisis, Africa and the citizens of Africa are ready. And IFC is going to push very strongly with a group of DFIs to develop different vaccine manufacturings, drug manufacturings, work with pharmaceutical companies for distribution, as well as with healthcare and hospitals. We're working very closely now with a group of banks that are helping smaller clinics get access to leased medical equipment with proper training and maintenance, so that that equipment can actually add value to the health systems in Africa. So a lot going on in this space, and you will see many more projects coming out from IFC.
Super. Thanks so much for talking us through that, Stephanie. But I'm going to stay with you, because obviously, even with questions of distribution of pharmaceuticals, should that capacity be improved on the continent, you know, the African Continental Free Trade Area would be very useful in kind of facilitating all of that. What do you see the agreement's impact as being? And do you think that any sector of the continent's private sector is particularly well placed to support the area?
So we are laser focused on the free trade agreement. It's going to be the largest free trade area in the world, 1.3 billion people. It's huge. And it's 54 countries and $3.4 trillion of GDP. So big opportunity. I think a lot's been said around vertical integration, consumer-led growth. But I think where we also need to focus is financial services in the financial sector. You can't have trade without trade finance. And today on the continent, trade finance, there's an $80 billion gap in trade finance, and it's growing rapidly. 50% of all of the SMEs that apply for trade finance, so which is 60% of GDP outside of South Africa, are rejected. So if we want to create trade and we want to create e-commerce and we want to create the interregional connectivity, we need to make trade available to the SMEs and to others that need it. So IFC has a global trade platform. We have onboarded 120 banks in Africa and 37 countries. Over the last decade, I think we've financed about $14 billion of trade, and the Africa represents about 32% of all the trade transactions we do, but we need to do much more. We need to be onboarding banks in every country in Africa so that we can support the growth of SMEs and support the growth of trade in the free trade agreement as it emerges.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Minister, I'm going to come to you. To be specific about the potential impact of the free trade agreement, what for you would be Egypt's challenges or opportunities on that front?
Well, we just concluded a few weeks ago the Egypt International Cooperation Forum, Egypt ICF, and one of the key points that were, or the sessions that were highlighted was the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And we had colleagues from Africa, leaders from Nigeria, from Cameroon, from Namibia, from the international community, and really everyone agreed that there is again harmonization in regulations that need to take place. The digital platforms. I agree with Stephanie also. The concept of financial services. So that is a way to catalyze and accelerate sort of the activation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Something else which is quite important is expertise within the continent is quite uneven. So there is a huge item called South-South cooperation where experience sharing, whether it comes to the types of financing, whether it comes to the value chains, the SMEs in the continent play a very important role. How can we push that agenda forward as well and create links with the bigger companies in our different countries? So for us as Egypt, notwithstanding the challenges, we just see opportunities going forward. But as I mentioned, we need to work on activating action plans related to the Africa Free Trade Agreement. Participants within the Egypt ICF issued a communique, and there's a whole section on the Africa Free Trade Agreement and the South-South cooperation. And these are steps that we are going to be working with other global leaders in Africa to move forward over the next 12 months. And it really includes all stakeholders, whether it's the international community, the governments, the private sector, financing for the private sector, and the civil society, which includes the SMEs.
Thanks so much, Minister. Carlos, besides easing trade within the bloc, do you think that we're missing any kind of trick with regards to the potential of the African Continental Free Trade Area? Other things that it could support, be it in the sectors of health, social impact, green transition, anything on top of that, anything that you think is undermining its potential scope?
I must confess that we are losing a bit of momentum with the Continental Free Trade Area. We had a very strong political push, and that was very much welcome. But with the pandemic has created a bit of a bog down in terms of the negotiations. We have been discussing rules of origin now for more than a year, so that's a bit. And we are seeing signs that there is less engagement on the part of the countries to negotiate as a bloc. And I say this because I'm helping the negotiations with Europe, and it's very worrisome that we have 17 different arrangements between Europe and Africa is losing a bit of policy space to be able to negotiate as one with Europe, which is our number one trading partner, and is going to define a bit our partnerships with the other big players such as the US, China, etc. And one of the reasons, Georgia, is because we have seen trade in isolation from the rest. Trade is actually just one component of regional integration. We also have the free movement of people, which is extremely important. We have the integration of infrastructure. We cannot really do all the investments that we are doing, particularly with the green transition coming, without taking into account the neighborhood and without taking into account, the scale that is required for certain types of infrastructure that will not be compatible with just one country per country, doing it. We have also the integration of the financial sector, as just been mentioned. It's extremely important, not just for trade finance, but in general, even for macroeconomic convergence. We have also the need for us to integrate uh, to a certain degree. I think it's there, but it's not been given the importance that is required. The dimensions relating to logistics, because our logistics is going to be more and more dependent on the blockchain and different developments that are taking place right now that are increasing the value of logistics. That's why during the pandemic, the logistics have become very profitable. And the example that was given in the introduction by Amir on Ethiopian Airlines is just one demonstration that Africans can do better. Amongst the ports that have had the largest growth in the world during 2020, there are two African ports, Tanger Med and Lomé. And this is not something to discount, because it's really quite a huge effort of trying to modernize and trying to be ahead of the curve in terms of the importance of logistics for the expansion of integration. But we need to do much more, and only when we actually embrace this comprehensiveness will be able to touch people in terms of their human capital development and all different aspects that will make them feel integration is for them.
Thanks so much, Carlos. So, Kuseni, we heard there just some of the fronts that Carlos thinks could be shored up to improve the effectiveness of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. However, we have come a long way. It's been a long time coming. 39 out of 54 countries have ratified it. It came into force this year. Do you feel that you've seen some kind of tangible indication that the continent's thinking is becoming more joined up?
Yeah, it's a very positive trend that we've seen. We've seen the political will being shown by leaders in terms of signing up to the African Continental Free Trade Area. We have indeed come a long way, but there are still challenges and there's still more work that needs to be done. If I can just share one example from a pharmaceutical perspective, the vaccines that we manufacture here in South Africa, they are of course, for South Africa, for the rest of Africa, and of course the rest of the world. And we find that to get the vaccines to where they are needed in Africa, sometimes they have to go via Europe and then back to the African continent, simply because it's faster that way. So there is a need for logistics and transport and infrastructure efficiencies to be looked at differently. I see that as another area of opportunity from an economic growth point of view and job creation point of view, if there is massive investment to really improve the intra-regional transport and logistics ecosystem in Africa. Without that, the extent to which we can benefit from the African Continental Free Trade Area is very likely to be limited. And the other area of importance is what Carlos mentioned. The free movement of people is also very crucial, and we still don't have the right kind of system that allows that. And that also requires the political will and commitment from the authorities to make sure that that happens. And the other aspect that is required to really give more substance to the African Continental Free Trade Area is for the private sector to be fully and effectively engaged with all the processes that are taking place. Sometimes it tends to happen between governments without really private sector role players being meaningfully engaged and incorporated in the discussions. And I think the sooner the private sector is meaningfully engaged and is brought in as an active participant in all the discussions, I think the better will be for Africa, and also the better we'll be able to benefit massively from the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Thanks so much, Kuseni. Now, one of the ways that you can support the private sector is trade finance. Minister, is there anything that Egypt's doing on that front that you think could be a template to be scaled up across the continent for greater impact?
Yes, so most recently, the central bank has created a company that provides sort of insurance for companies that go actually and invest in Africa. So there have been, policies taken on our side to try and push that integration within the continent. We are all working with the different development partners to try and see how we can create blended finance tools and try and activate a little bit more the lending that happens to companies that also want to replicate what they've done here in different African countries. Connectivity is a very important, catalyst for pushing trade, and that's why there's also the Cairo-Cape Town Road, which we are working on completing again with the development partners and other African countries. So there are several steps that are taking place. Also bringing back the discussion, during the forum, and Stephanie was on one of the panels there as well. So we thank her for her participation. Was actually to see how all of us can, make use of it so that we fulfill that potential. But there is a very clear understanding that our future is all tied together. As global supply chains faced issues during the pandemic, the regional supply chains seem to be a very important and robust alternative that we need to focus on, notwithstanding, of course, also the employment opportunities for the growing populations, the young populations, and the promise that this carries.
Thank you so much, Minister. A lot of stake there. Stephanie, clearly a conversation you've already had. You've had multiple times with the Minister. So just tell us a bit more about what kinds of approaches you believe would best support expanding financing for trade and integration in Africa.
Well, Georgia, so much has been said, but I think there's maybe two areas I would touch on and drill down, because I think we haven't covered them well enough. The first is technology and digitization. Africa has the opportunity to digitize trade finance. And you heard Carlos mention blockchain. Technologies like blockchain will allow for greater transparency, lower transaction costs, reduction of risk, and also, to be really frank, building consumer trust in products that people are buying. And so I always use the example of pork and blockchain. So simultaneously, Chipotle in the United States had an E. coli outbreak. They couldn't trace where their pork came from, and their stock price dropped 40% overnight. At the same time, Walmart actually could go farm to table using blockchain technology with pork that was coming from China and had no issues whatsoever. So those are the kinds of technologies we need to bring to Africa as we expand trade. And together with that, we're going to need better policy and regulation around digitization, and we're going to have to build the soft skills that will allow that digitization to take place. And that includes customs services. It means helping banks digitize and helping them understand how to run digital trade platforms. It also means helping SMEs learn the technology skills to use digital trade. The second area, we've talked a lot about verticalization and pulling smaller SMEs into supply chains. In order to do that, we need to generate receivables-backed financing for these smaller SMEs so that they're actually stable enough to be good and strong and reliable partners to the larger companies to whom they're supplying product. So we've started very recently a receivables-backed financing program globally. It's growing, but it's pretty small. We've only done about $1.7 billion. But we need to bring that to the African continent, and we need to make sure that as we vertically integrate these companies, that we're supporting the SMEs with receivables-backed financing.
Thanks, Stephanie. Kusani, you're advocating there for just more conversations, bringing the private sector into more kind of important conversations as to the future of trade on the continent. Do you think enough's being made of the potential scope of public-private partnerships?
Yeah, I think that's an area of massive improvement. The extent to which the private sector and the public sector work together in Africa, it's still not advanced. I think it's compared to other regions elsewhere in the world, there is more, sometimes you find more polarization, and you also find an us and them kind of approach, and I think you need a much more cooperative and collaborative approach between the public and the private sector. And that is an area of massive improvement that needs to be leveraged. The gap that is there between the public sector and the private sector sometimes is not helpful. And sometimes you find in some markets, actually, a kind of hostile attitude towards the private sector. It's being seen as the enemy rather than as a partner. That needs to change. We need to reset that paradigm, because it's very clear that the countries that are able to create jobs and provide a better life for their people have got stronger private sectors. And the countries that are more stable and democratic, they tend to have much more resilient private sectors. And I think Africa's problem is the lack of a strong and resilient private sector, rather than the private sector being a problem itself. I think it has to be seen as a positive and powerful force for good. And governments have to realize that it is the private sector that creates jobs, that creates a tax base, and that enables government to have resources to spend on social expenditure and public expenditure to improve the welfare of the populace. I would say that's a massive area of opportunity for improvement. There are signs. There are good examples. I mean, Rwanda is a great example. We're seeing countries like Kenya and Uganda also are really good in terms of supporting the private sector, but it's not everywhere. It's not across the continent. You find that in some instances, companies are punished for things that are not really justifiable in law, and the regulations have to change, and they have to be more investor friendly as well across the continent. If we don't do that, the African Continental Free Trade Area will just be a pipe dream, and we have to underpin it with very investor friendly environments across the continent.
Thanks, Hussaini. So, setting out there just the importance of the kind of state backing and state support of private sector activities. But Carlos, what do you think that the private sector could and should be doing for itself in order to put it in the best position to bounce back from the pandemic?
I think the pandemic has given us a lesson that we need some repurposing, and that it has worked very well during the pandemic. It has also demonstrated that when we have focus, transformations take place much faster, including opportunities for industrialization that have been put upfront during the discussions over the last 2 years. And I think we also need a better ecosystem. And part of the ecosystem, obviously, is the responsibility of governments. But the private sector can play a role. For instance, we have lots of savings that are not productively invested. This is particularly true for the pension funds and other institutional funds. We have accumulated about $1 trillion worth of funds that are not being properly invested. And I think the private sector ought to be the engine that transforms these savings into something that is a bit more tangible and helps the transformation of the African economies. We cannot just count on support from the external actors. I think they are most welcome, but they will never make the trick. It has to be a combination of how we use our savings and improve them for sure, but it has to be also about how we tax better. We have a deficit of taxation in Africa. Our fiscal pressure is very low, and partly is because of some degrees of informality of people that are being exempted from paying taxes despite their economic wealth. We have also a lot of exemptions that are not justified. We have lots of value, particularly in real estate, that are not properly capitalized. So all of this machinery needs to be improved. And a bit of the resistance comes from the private sector. So we need to actually have a very frank and candid discussion about how we improve taxation. We make it progressive, so we pay according to what we earn, not to penalize the poor. But definitely Africa is lagging behind in terms of its fiscal pressure. And finally, we need also to capitalize on how we actually integrate the small and medium enterprises. I think the banking sector, for instance, is very keen on supporting the large players, but very reluctant in supporting the small and medium enterprises partly because of the regulatory framework, but also partly because there is no appetite. It's more risky. And, they prefer that some capital comes from outside, let's say from the IFC, just to make a little provocation, and then they manage it, but they will not put their own capital into some of this risky business, which is absolutely essential. Because without the SMEs, we are not going to create the number of jobs that are necessary for us to really absorb this demographic boom that we are living. So I think there are a number of things that the private sector has to do to contribute to improving the ecosystem, and not just expect the government to be the actor that occupies this space.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for all of your insightful and important observations about what can be done with regard to trade in the continent in the post-pandemic world. That is it for that particular conversation. Time now for a quick 15-minute break, after which we'll see you all back here for the first of our conversations of the day, which will be with Abdul Samad Rabiu, who'll be talking about his take on how business growth can be sustained on the continent despite the drag caused by the crazy last 18 months. Stay with us.